Super. Perfect. Okay.
Oh, okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. And thank you, Tom, for sharing with us this morning for this class. I'll let you introduce yourself, and then not much to say. There we go. We'll get started then. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate that very much. Appreciated the teachings past the last several weeks, and maybe we'll kind of stop back and kind of carry some of those themes as we kind of try to unpiece some of these parables. Thanks, Justin. I am not a very technologically adept at all, so I just lost my notes. Okay. No idea where they went to, unless I deleted it.
Oh, where that would be. Oh, yeah.
Okay, well. Okay, so be it. Anyway, so these are some perplexing parables. I think there's probably some debate whether two of these anyway are actually, whether any of these this morning are actually parables. That might not be the focus we have to really kind of work with. You know, many of the times Jesus begins, so the kingdom of God is like this. In the kingdom of God, the poor are blessed, the peacemakers are honored, the meek have a stake in the land, and they're kind of illustrative ways to kind of describe something beyond us. Okay. Whether these three are actually parables or not, I'm not sure. But they certainly are perplexing. Okay. I think one of the first responses anybody would have in response to the very first parable we're going to read through would be what? Because it's just very confounding. It's not the things we would necessarily, I would not necessarily assume would come from Jesus' mouth. But I'd like to start. One of the difficulties I ran into is we have a new kitten, and Nochi, and he about 5 times decided to run across my keyboard as I was putting this together. So any errors, I'm going to put on him. Okay. I'd like to start with a poem from Mary Oliver. She's an Episcopalian writer from New England. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice through the whole house. Began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations through though their melancholy. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own. It kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. In the last weeks, Chris walked us through blessings and woes. We heard contrasts and comparisons. I think there's questions of abundance and scarcity. There are patrons and stewards. One of the things that tends to ride through, particularly in the passages for this morning, are questions of salvation. Who can be saved? How can we possibly be saved? What must I do to inherit life of the ages? But these are some of the, and I think that these we might want to kind of play with these this morning a little bit to see how do they get fleshed out. How are these maybe perhaps extensions, the teachings today are extensions of some of the things that Chris and John David brought to us before. One of the things that I believe, was it you, John David, brought the question of stewards last week? I think both of you did. Okay. And here we begin with a question about a story about a steward. What I'm looking at, do you want to go back through the connection to The Greek word,
We're looking at a word that's used. Oikon is a house, basically talking about a householder or one who's responsible for, often the head of the house, who is responsible for the entire system of the household.
yeah. So today we talk about a steward. This is from the 16th chapter of Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was once a rich man who had a manager. He got reports that the manager had been taking advantage of his position by running up huge personal expenses. So he called him in and said, 'What's this I hear about you? You're fired, and I want a complete audit of your books.' The manager or the steward said to himself, 'What am I going to do? I've lost my job as a manager. I'm not strong enough for a laboring job, and I'm too proud to beg. And I've got a plan. Here's what I'll do. Then when I'm turned out into the street, people will take me into their houses.' The steward, master of the house, is also plotting a way that I will not be bereft, and others will take me into their houses. And then he went at it. One after another, he called in the people who were in debt to his master, and he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' It seems as if he doesn't even have access to the books anymore. He replied, 100 jugs of olive oil. The manager said, 'Here, take your bill. Sit down here, quick now, write 50. The next, he said, 'And you, what do you owe?' And he answered, 100 sacks of wheat. He said, 'Take your bill, write in 80. Now here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. And why? Because he knew how to look after himself. Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They are in constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials, so you'll live, really live, and not complacently just get by on good behavior." And then Jesus went on to make these comments. "If you're honest in small things, you'll be honest in big things. If you're a crook in small things, you'll be a crook in big things. If you're not honest in small jobs, who will put you in charge of the store? No worker can serve two bosses. He'll either hate the first and love the second, or adore the first and despise the second. You can't serve both God and the bank." What are some things you hear? What are some observations?
The inconsistencies,
Inconsistencies.
a little troubling,
Say it again.
a little perplexing.
Oh, yeah, I think like one of the greatest response to this, what? This doesn't sound quite as what we hear from Jesus other times, yeah.
Well, to me, like getting along with what Jeff said, all I could think is, well, then Trump is fine.
Sure.
I mean,
Okay.
you know, he's elevated and then he reduces down and he doesn't pay his suppliers.
Uh-huh.
But for me, half the parables, I don't understand. I mean,
Fair enough.
I just,
Well, you're just with the disciples because they're always looking around, what does he mean? Yeah. Whenever people use Jesus as an example of a good teacher, I'm thinking you haven't really read the text.
See the lesson plan.
It doesn't seem like anybody's really getting it. Everybody's kind of left scratching their heads. Yeah, but it does seem really odd. Okay, then I mean, and the word here is in the Greek is mammon, which is a god, another deity. Okay, and so it's all about serving mammon. But it seems like if you can kind of get off with fixing the books and doing whatever to get by.
I'm not sure if it's first time it jumped out at me. I'm not sure if it's particular to that translation, but the call for personal responsibility. It talks about being streetwise and knowing how to navigate your own personal environment, social environment. Kind of jumped out at me with that translation. I'm not sure. I'd have to read the translation and see if it's there.
Also, Peterson's the message.
Paraphrase.
It's just the one that I grabbed this morning on my way out the door. So it's not really a true translation, but he picks up some things and some things probably not as much. But yeah, but say that again. Just the sense of personal responsibility.
Yeah, and learning to navigate and succeed and negotiate within your own social environment and network and situation you find yourself in. I hadn't gotten out of that out of that parable.
At the end of the day, he's responsible for finding his way. What else? What are things you find?
He may have also not only found his way, but found a way to solve the problem of his master. The fact that these people have owed him money for a long while, evidently, and it's not been able to be brought to a resolution, he came up with a shrewd way to solve the problem that his master begins to get some money. He granted, in some cases, it's only half on the dollar, but he's come up with a way to, by reducing the amount that this is what you owe, we're like, if you pay this much, you'll get away with it. But if you do it now, well, now he gets his money, he gets some cash up front that the man's able to be used. So it may be that he's able to solve some of the problem of getting people to pay up who haven't been paid.
It's kind of like his debt liquidation service.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
We'll pay, give me X on the dollar.
Yeah. Now I don't know who I owe credit for that concept. It's not mine, but I'm intrigued by that way of interpreting. I've never read it that way, and I don't know how accurate that is as a way to think about it, but it's one way to think.
One of the things I'm always surprised at is the surprise. Jesus said, "Hey, surprise!" The master says, "Good job."
Yeah.
So he seems to he might still have lost his job. We don't. There's some things that are left hanging that we don't really get an answer to. But he's surely assured that his master got something.
But then he followed it up by, if you're honest with small things, you'll be honest with big things. This is a complete turning it on its head. I don't understand why.
Yeah. So we're gonna move on from that one. No, no. There's many. This by itself, this could take this parable by itself or this story by itself just raises so many of those cumbersome things. That little, it's kind of proverbial, kind of a proverb then at the end. Yeah, if you're honest or capable of small things, you're really capable and honest of big things. If you're crooked small things, you'll be a crook of big things. And then Jesus is saying, gotta kind of find a way here. He's kind of actually using this as something of maybe not a model, but he's certainly also, like the master, Jesus seems to be commending him as well. Yeah.
Well, how does this parable fit in with if you're low income? And your money talks doesn't even fit in there. Because you're so concerned about your own livelihood.
Sure. And so who are all these debts from? Who owes the debts?
The person,
People at the bottom.
People at the bottom. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we've touched on this numerous times before, that the Galilee, that that whole Levant area had a small elite, and then a large peasantry, and then a small middle class, and the steward would be part of this little middle class right here. This is his area. So actually, of the stories we read, we might have more in common with him than some others, or the other people in Jesus' stories. And you think about his life. His task is to generate as much income as possible for his master. And that could be, now, Jews were not to charge interest to other Jews. And that kind of got carried into medieval Europe as well, where Christians were not to charge interest to other Christians, but Jews could. And so while there might be many pogroms against Jews through the Rhineland and other times throughout all of medieval Europe, Jews were able to function as bankers and the people who were able to charge interest that kind of spurred along European, medieval economies, and then particularly as we kind of moved into early capitalism. So that little kind of biblical injunction fed that as well. But that didn't mean they couldn't charge exorbitant prices. Okay, you just don't really know what principle and what the interest is. Okay. His task is to churn out as much income as possible, as much profit. So that means he is under the thumb of his master to produce more. But he's also getting the complaints and the disconnection from these people. It's the classic problem of middle management, right? Yeah. The decisions that you make are relatively small. And you think about this guy's life. Okay, he recognizes he has fallen out of favor with him, but he hasn't really generated favor with the rest of society. He's a lonely man. He's a disconnected man. He's a man really without a real household, at least a household that values him for something other than what he can generate. That's the world he lives in. High pressure. And there's two words I wanted to pick out here real quickly. The one is the accusations are digliti, which usually is slanderous. We don't really know who's making these accusations, but it might be his coworkers, but it's people not on his side. Again, he's a man without a household, man without a family. The other word that I find kind of interesting here is that he is accused of diasporizon, wasting his money. Now that's a word that shows up a few times. It's in the parable of the prodigal son. What did he do? Okay, he diasporizoned. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. But I'm gonna play with it there. Yeah, he diasporizoned his father's estate. He wasted it. But it's also in the Magnificat. What happens to the crowd? They are diasporizoned. They are scattered. So it's a question to me in terms. This is a question. I think these stories probably hold up a mirror for us as viewers. And translators have had an option here in terms of how they translate this word. How do we often think about this story? How would you often characterize the steward? In the materials we have, they call him the shrewd steward. Anybody else have you ever seen the chapter headings in the passages, how he might be referred to?
Unjust.
Unjust. Okay. Yeah. Unjust, dishonest. Okay. Ched Myers, who is he's really more of a Marx scholar. Ched calls him the. This is where my notes would be helpful.
But they're scattered.
But they're scattered. He talks about him as someone who is detoxifying. He's moving out of that system. But that's not the word he's looking for. Yeah.
Going back to your little diagram there on the board, perhaps he's in the past, and I mean, I'm reading a lot into the story, but he's seen a lot of injustices in what the demands that were made on the lower class, and they're bound up in a never-ending cycle of this debt. Now he's freed of his obligation to the master or to making money. So what would he do in that circumstance? Maybe he's coming back to what he thought would have been a more fair and just due from the other people all along.
Sure. And I mean, there's some commentators who suggest that all he's doing is taking off the kind of the unjust adages, and he's just really kind of going back to more of a base. Yeah. Yeah, please.
I don't have the text in front of me, so I'm not quite sure what it says, but at the very end, it's language like hating one and loving the other. So is this from the perspective of the steward? Is that what you would make out of? So, I mean, I read it and well, that's just terrible. Boy, am I loving, who am I loving and who am I hating? But it's only if I'm a steward from that perspective. Is that correct? Read the text. I don't read. I don't.
And again, this is from the Message, so it's no worker can serve two bosses. He'll either hate the first and love the second, or adore the first and despise the second. You can't serve both God and the bank. In the Greek, it's Mammon, the god Mammon. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seems that Jesus, this might be Jesus' commentary on the whole thing, trying to make a little sense of this fiasco here. Yeah. Clarence Jordan, who worked in the South, would always kind of point out that and he did what the Cotton Patch Gospel. Okay. He would say in his rendition of this, he said that it's not that you shouldn't serve God and Mammon, you can't. You can't. So it seems like this seems to be Jesus' commentary saying, clarifying that when you're trying to serve two masters, you can't. It's too terrifying. It tears you up. And I think about like what's the existential, like what's this guy's life like? Okay. He's no longer under the protection of the master. And the reality is all this time he's been a man with really no household, no connection. And one of the things that he starts to plot is, okay, if I can't be a steward at oikonos, I need to find a new household. I need to find a new place where I will be accepted. One is run by, we sacrifice relationships for capital, for money, for gain, for financial security. The other is really going back to really wilderness kind of times. It beckons back to the time in the wilderness, which is outside of the controls of empire, but inside the area of hospitality. What's required for survival for him is the hospitality of others. He's no longer under patronage. He's no longer being paid, which again, part of this, I think, is pointing out this is how this system works. It's not a good system. It's alienating. You know, it's deadening. Jesus, there's a passage here where Jesus talks about this. He says, oh yeah, this is down below. I didn't even get to this. What society sees and calls monumental, God sees through and calls monstrous. God's law and the prophets climaxed in John. Now it's all kingdom of God, the glad news, and its compelling invitation to every man and woman. The sky will disintegrate and the earth will dissolve before a single letter of God's law wears out. And then he says, using the legalities of divorce as a cover for lust is adultery. Using the legalities of marriage as a cover for lust is adultery. You got that? Okay. Using the legalities of divorce as a cover for lust is adultery. Using the legalities of marriage as a cover for lust is adultery. Again, what? And it's an odd thing to tack on here. He's talking about a steward. He's talking about a household. He's talking about the whole system of how people relate. No longer is it just about economics. It's really about how people relate with each other. What allows us to survive? What allows us to thrive? What allows human life to be fruitful? This system, with many, very, very few at the top, squeezes everybody else. This guy is a man with no place. His task, and this seems to be what maybe Jesus is saying, is we need to work in the shell. Something's going to die. He says here, what society sees and calls monumental, this accumulation of wealth, God sees through it. He calls it monstrous. It's detrimental. It's deadening. It will die. It seems, well, yeah, go ahead.
This is this may not hold any water at all, but it just occurred to me that the overarching purpose of our gathering here is to think about our endowments and how we use them and what they're for. And is there any way that we fit into that diagram right there? Are we the middle managers in there? Our endowments are what we're beholden to. We can go back to the wilderness, the days when we had no endowments, and then we're dependent upon the community. I have this is a half-baked thought, but it just seemed like maybe it fits in there some way.
I think parables and Jesus stories should concoct lots of half-baked thoughts. No, I mean, off the beans, I really think this is really what Jesus is encouraging us to do is be imaginative. Okay. He's kind of saying, the shell, this is dying. It doesn't look like death, but it's dying. Or at least it perpetrates death. Really what the gospel was about, the kingdom life is about, is hospitality. We need to find spaces for one another. That's what we'll do, here in an hour or so. What's more intimate than, that's kind of what Jesus says. They're going to come after me, they'll come after you, so watch each other's feet. So you have to create space for one another. So I think that we very much are here. Weeks past we talked about patrons, people who have money and they're able to concoct that for Jesus' ministry. Okay, and you see through history, that kind of thing happens over and over and over again. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, established this little seminary, and that was truly at the graces of a woman who had great wealth, and she was able to make that. She was able to open her purse and make that possible. Over and over and over again, we have stories of people who are able to make their wealth available. Ori Miller, founder of Mennonite Central Committee, I believe his wife came from a family of I forget what they manufactured, but again, it was great wealth, and that's because can't imagine Leicester Conference Mennonites back in that part of the area opening up their pocketbooks too big. So that was very much funded by their own personal wealth. So we have this is, I think this is the thing. Jesus is kind of saying, we live in this screwed up world, okay? And you can walk at him and say, well, Trump's okay, because he's just doing what this world's about. I would like to suggest that what Jesus is encouraging us to do is we need to be imaginative. In the shell of what we have, how does that work? Still be able to be faithful in small things and in big things. I'm not quite sure what time it is.
9:45.
Okay. Okay. Wendell Berry, I'm not sure if he's still alive. He's a farmer and professor and poet. And he writes about what he calls the two economies, which I think is germane to this. We can presume that we are outside the membership that includes us, but that presumption only damages the membership. And of course, and of ourselves, of course, along with it. This scenario, this is happy to divide us into that pyramid. The reward is the accumulation of wealth. I wonder if these parables, and I'm drawing heavily from a book by William Herzog called Parables as Subversive Speech. Can't even say it. And Herzog's proposal is that some of these stories are holding up a mirror for us, see ourselves, and to see society more correctly. So I think your half-baked idea is actually right in line with maybe what some of the intent of these is not to offer a final solution. It's a messy world. It's a messy world, yeah, and we probably identify more with the steward than we do with many of the peasants or the peasantry that Jesus speaks of.
Once you become beholden to the patron,
Right? How much freedom do you
you're
really have?
beholden.
Right? He finds himself actually not free. He recognizes, I can't beg, and I'm going to die. I'm going to die either begging or die by my hand, by digging. I'm not going to survive. The next story, and this is a chiasm. These are two stories that really flow together with really no break. They seem to be repeating in some ways the same thing, perhaps even backwards a bit. And again, instead of we could call this whole story a story of two rich men and a steward without a job who is struggling to be can he beg or not, and the other who truly is a beggar. But that seems to be the theme here. But Jesus begins the same way. There once was a rich man, expensively dressed in the latest fashions, wasting his days in conspicuous consumption. Okay, when we just had that word, wasting, scattering his days. A poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, had been dumped on his doorstep. In other translations, at the gateway. All he lived for was to get a meal from scraps off the rich man's table. His best friends were the dogs who came and licked his sores. And then he died, this poor man, and he was taken up by the angels to the lap of Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell and in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham in the distance and Lazarus in his lap, or the others held in Abram's bosom. He called out, "Father Abraham, mercy, have mercy. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in water to cool my tongue. I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that in your lifetime, you got the good things and Lazarus the bad things. It's not like that here. Here, he's consoled and you're tormented. Besides, in all these matters, there is a huge chasm set between us so that no one can go from us to you, even if he wanted to. Not can anyone cross over from you to us." The rich man said, "Then let me ask you, Father, send him to the house of my father where I have 5 brothers, so he can tell them the score and warn them so they won't end up here in this place of torment." Abraham answered, "They have Moses and the prophets to tell them the score. Let them listen to them." "I know, Father Abraham," he said, "but they're not listening. If someone came back to them from the dead, they would change their ways." Abraham replied, "If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced by someone who rises from the dead." What are some of your observations? Tough. What's the tough?
Well, I mean, it's crossed the lines. I mean, it's you've got to listen.
Why did he continue to see Lazarus as a servant?
He wants Lazarus to go do his bidding, to be his servant. Go have him go do this for me. Is that what you're saying?
You know, why did he pick Lazarus as the one to tell his brothers?
I had a slide here. I think I must have lost it. Comparisons between what do you see as some of the comparisons or contrast between these two in the story?
Well, the wealthy man is extremely wealthy in this life, but doesn't worry about Lazarus who's at his door.
Okay.
And Lazarus has nothing,
So
but may have more love. I mean, I think of some of the stories you read about some of the homeless people who take such care for their animals.
In the last story, the servant mediated for the rich man, made it possible for the rich man to be a blessing to those on the lower income level, and may have redeemed him from the end result of the rich man in this story, who had no one to intervene and help him care for the poor. So picking up on what you're saying, I mean, it just is sort of I never thought about comparing these two before. It's sort of an interesting thing. I echo Ralph's comment to a degree also that in the global economy, we are in the upper 10%. I would say most all of us.
Upper 1% actually.
Are we in the upper 1%? That's even more scary. But I'm going to be a little kinder to myself and say that's the but anyhow, either way, we're still in that upper tier. Is my observation in the global economy, and I'm left with, okay, what am I really doing as an individual and as a congregation? We have done some things. How much is expected, and how much am I really doing? I feel it's sometimes like caught in that inferno of being uncertain about what is my real place as a good steward.
I am really intrigued with the dogs in this story because they have more compassion. They're licking they're licking his wounds and have So they're kind of the heroes of the story because they have compassion. But I just find that a fascinating contrast.
Kind of, this is an interesting picture because it's got this two windows with this chasm between them there. And the kind of, if you think about Abraham as the personification of the faith tradition, just leave it at that. You know, he verbalizes that our tradition, what God wants through the law and the prophets, you have violated. That has put you where you are. That is not what, and I'm here. I'm not going to mitigate for you. Your opportunity to do that is past. Our faith tradition and our law and prophets that are written down there. It's there for everyone to read and to follow. There's no other way to get around that. Nobody else that can intervene for you. You personally have to care for the poor and wounded and needy. And you had your opportunity to do that. And the people that are alive have their opportunities to do that. And that's what our law and prophets call for and tradition calls for. And you've missed your opportunity to fit in there. So,
Yeah, so Abraham is kind of a personification of the elders, the whole tradition, canopy under which they all live. And being received into the bosom of Abraham. You know, there's just like that kind of intimacy I'm held here. It's just in contrast to where the dogs took care of him before. But yeah, he's saying like, you know, this is not new news. You've heard it. You should have heard of this before.
I'm thinking of vulnerability, and the poor in both stories are the vulnerable people, but they depend on one another. They have those relationships, and when we are vulnerable, we are closer to God. When we are most vulnerable, when we are grieving, or when we are in some kind of crisis, that's when we turn to God most closely. That's when we are vulnerable. That's when we are closest to God. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here, that allowing yourself to be vulnerable. If you think you're going to be in control of your money and your future, you're not being vulnerable, and you're not going to be close to God.
And that's a really good segue to the next passage, but we're not going to go there quite yet. So we'll come back.
I'm interested in this idea of the chasm. The chasm between the rich and the poor, I think it could be the holy and the unholy, or the ones who followed the word and didn't, as was mentioned. But on earth, there was also a chasm, and it was set by the gate. Yeah. Lazarus couldn't cross that gate, and the rich man wouldn't come out. And so the opportunity to help and to set things straight would have been on earth, to open that gate and at least bring food out, healthcare, whatever, while the opportunity was there. And afterwards, it's too late to do it. So I think there's two chasms here.
This life reflects into whatever the next life. There's yeah. We'll come back to that in a second.
I see a connection between Luke's Beatitudes that I think Chris talked about 2 weeks ago and this. They're both in Luke. And blessed are the hungry now, because they'll be fulfilled. So we're talking about reversals at that time, and I see
this is a great reversal. It's a great reversal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's another way we could probably talk about the story. The great reversal.
Well, even in the afterlife, the rich man could not see Lazarus as an equal. Even in his most desperate circumstance, he could not bring himself to see Lazarus as an equal, even though he saw Lazarus in a preferred position at that time.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to that a little bit ago. Yeah. that he's still calling on Lazarus to do this. As if, that status hasn't been broken.
I think this kind of emphasizes to me a human trait that I don't think I'm too proud of, but I think it's true. When you look at the United States right now, we have a great division of thought and thinking. It's portrayed in this that we Lazarus or what is the other man's name? The ruler or whatever, the household man. He wants to have his brothers come and be told by Lazarus that this is a dangerous thing. You better change your course in life so you don't end up like me. But he's told that no, they will not change their minds. And I think that is so true. We are not easily changed. Our minds are not easily changed once we make up our mind.
Not even resurrection will change their lives.
Right. So that is not a very good human trait. And I think I see it today. Well, I see it in all of us, really. And then you see it in the story also.
Well, I'm hearing all these illustrious people who have a lot more education in the sayings and the gospels and so forth. But what are you saying to me who perhaps don't understand all these? I use the word eschatological. Please do. What are you saying to me? I'm going to call myself a lay person. What are you saying to me? Money talks. Are you saying I need to? I mean, I'm a widow. Are you saying I should give everything that I have to the poor? But what about my own living to sustain myself?
You'll notice at no point here, so far, is Jesus saying you need to give up everything. I would wonder if he's really not, again, I'm not sure this is an overt kind of teaching. I'm going to raise this up as this is really more of a commentary on what do we see when we look in the mirror? And that should probably, and I really appreciate Jeff, half-baked ideas, because I think really this is about spurring imagination. Okay. How do we live in this disparate world? I came across something, I don't know if this is true today, but the statistics I was reading suggested that there's greater economic disparity in the US than there is in Russia. And that's a country with oligarchs, so we do too. But I would just suggest that recognize, I pulled out the one word in terms of how they translated wasted. Some of this I think is to recognize simply, we live in economic environments, okay? That influences how we think. It influences what we think is just and fair. It's the stuff we breathe in, so we're not necessarily going to be aware of it. The translators opted to translate that instead of scattered, like the proud are scattered in Magnificat, in Mary's song. They chose to translate that as wasted. Another thing he was doing, it wouldn't really change it changed the story a little bit, is that he was scattering. If he's scattering, that changes a little bit, because at that point we start to see this guy has already probably been trying to even the scales a little bit. Yeah.
But how does that translate down into our huge endowment for the church?
And I'm glad I'm not tasked with answering that question.
Well, that's thinking outside the box. How does it translate?
Right. Again, we've had stories of patrons. We've had stories of just kind of trying to clarify, this is the world we live in. We need to do something imaginative that's gospel fed and how we put together our economic lives. And I suspect, because the reference is back to the eternal tense, I wonder if that's not a throwback to the days of wandering in the wilderness, where they were dependent upon the vulnerability and reliance on manna and not mammon. They were reliant upon hospitality and those kind of relationships and not the structures that oppress. Somebody,
Well, I was actually almost what I was about to say here too, is this is, I think in this story, we're talking about money and wealth. I mean, because it starts out identifying them as a rich man and a poor man. And then it uses as an example, food in this life and water in the afterlife. But it's really about breaking down the barriers and the communal sharing and recognizing the humanity of each other. It's using the food and the water as physical examples of that, but it's really about the relationships between the people that it is really, I think, more the point of the story.
and again, and in this world where things are tilted towards oppression and injustice and separation, how do we bring up some half-baked thoughts to be creative in this? Because he says, these people are better, they're more streetwise. Pay attention. Okay? I just want to say I really appreciate. I'm just recognizing I didn't need to get up at 4 o'clock this morning to put this PowerPoint together. I could have just without telling you what the read the scripts or just No, I really appreciate this. But yeah.
One of the interesting things is Lazarus seems to be homeless to some degree, and we have a huge homeless population. I think in Harrisburg it says it's per capita, it's about the worst in the nation. We have lots and lots of people who just live on the street or are on somebody's couch for who knows, and then they have to leave. And the Mormons out in Salt Lake City, the Mormon church, whatever they are, the Latter-day Saints came together and they decided we're not going to have homeless people in Salt Lake City. And the church got together with the people, and they're in the process of trying to make sure everybody who has been homeless is no longer on the street if they choose. And, but we can't get that here. One thing helps there is the church says we are buying into this.
Well, if you're LDS, you're not going to starve.
Right. Or even if you aren't, but yeah.
Right, but even within their own kind of welfare system.
Right.
Yeah. So some years ago, the city of Denver decided that it was more cost efficient. Who knows the story? Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say the whole idea of housing first. That it's less expensive to house a person than it is to let them be on the street and pay for all the police services and emergency services. So this should be a conservative and progressive common ground.
But underneath that, again, we have this sense we deserve certain things. And that's fed by our economy. That's fed by all these other kind of voices within us, which I think this this story is kind of raising up. Jesus is saying, we need to recognize that it is a shell, but we're being formed by these things. That was one of the biggest issues in Denver and other places well, yeah, but they don't deserve housing. And for them, it was a cost-effective basis. Like they're clogging up the emergency departments. If they have small houses and 6 months later they burn it down and they go in a vendor, so be it. They're still housed, and they're not freezing to death in the winter. So yeah, I just want to kind of turn a corner here. Sandy pointed out something that I think is really important. We know Lazarus' name.
And we know Abraham's name.
And we know Abraham's name. We don't know the rich man's name. We know that he's clothed with purple, very expensive. We know he's wealthy. We know he feasts every day. Okay. For everybody here, we feast occasionally, and it's always communal. The rich man, one of the things Abraham has pointed out is you don't know, you're not biblically literate. You don't know your own scriptures, or you haven't paid attention. Another thing about Lazarus, we know he is destitute. At this point, the hospitality, the household seems to have fallen apart. It's no longer enough. And that's probably one of the signs, at least in our society, of real poverty. Until I lose, kind of mental stability, I'm an educated, white, cisgendered, heterosexual, Pennsylvania Dutch man, there's enough safety nets to kind of catch me between family and other kinds of things. Poverty seems to, in some ways, have to do with when even those basic structures of hospitality and conviviality no longer work. Nothing works. And it seems as if Lazarus is in a world where even household systems there aren't working for him. He's destitute outside of that. Yeah, but you recognize there's a lot of comparisons and contrasts. Okay, we have two rich men. We don't know either of their names. We only know the other guy by what he does, steward. But we do know something about Lazarus. We know his name. We got these comparisons and contrasts. Yeah.
I just want to go back to Anna's comment. What does this have to do with our endowment funds? And I keep coming back to it has everything to do with our endowment fund, because our personal decisions are microcosms of the corporate decisions. And that's why we're here.
Well, I'm going on, piggybacking on Anna's, I mean, from a personal standpoint, we don't know what our healthcare costs are gonna be down the road. So yes, unless you want to go in and go on Medicaid because you have no money, which then affects any institution you're in, because then their Medicaid doesn't pay what it costs to provide care. It's sort of like a fine balance, and I think that's where we are here, the fine balance. How much is too much, but you need to have some cushion, because none of us know. And unfortunately, in this, well, I know in this state, I've already decided, I think Vermont, there's euthanasia. That's my plan. I mean, I don't want to tell my kids that. My son, they already bought me off. But, my thing is, I don't want to be housed in a nursing home. I mean, I saw how my mother died of ALS. No way do I want that. And, we treat our animals, in my regard, better than we treat our humans. And so there is that fine line. I need to have some cushion for that possibility.
And recognize, yeah.
I don't think Jesus wants, God wants anyone to have to not be cared for. But if we spread it out, there is enough.
And
Not that
recognize,
scarcity.
in my opinion, Jesus is really spotlighting. He says, this is going to kill you. It's destruction. He's holding up the mirror and we see, okay, this kind of set of relationships, the way this structures who we are and how we relate, what our values are, what our priorities are, it's not going to sustain us. I think what's challenging is I kind of see Lazarus as he's even beyond the sustainability of, he's certainly a victim of this, most likely, but one that has also perhaps even crunched out that household, that basic kind of kinship. Yeah.
For much of the time, we talk about either or, rich or poor, endowment funds, hold it or spend it all at one time. I think the critical point is if we decide to change, what are the tools we'll use to transition, and that over what period of time? And that will be a critical element at that point, depending on what our basic decision is. What is the transition? How do we do it?
Somewhere in one of Paul's letters, he talks about how we have the churches, the folks that have their feet in both the age, the dying age and the coming age. And well, I think that's, yeah. So I want to just touch on this one really briefly. We won't really open this one up very much. One day, one of the local officials asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to deserve eternal life?" Or in Greek, it's Zoe Aeon, the life of the ages. Jesus said, "Why are you calling me good? No one's good, only God. You know the commandments, don't you? No illicit sex, no killing, no stealing, no lying, honor your father and your mother." He said, "I've kept them as all for as long as I can remember." And when Jesus heard that, he said, "Then there's only one thing left to do. Sell everything you own and give it away to the poor. You will have riches in heaven. Then come follow me." This was the last thing the official expected to hear. He was very rich and became terribly sad. He was holding on tight to a lot of things and not about to let them go. And seeing his reaction, Jesus said, "Do you have any idea how difficult it is for people who have it all to enter God's kingdom?" I'd say it's easier to thread a camel through a needle's eye than to get a rich person into God's kingdom. Then who has any chance at all? The others asked. No chance at all, Jesus said. If you think you can pull it off by yourself, every chance in the world if you trust God to do it. Peter tried to regain some initiative. We left everything we owned and followed you, didn't we? Yes, said Jesus, and you won't regret it. No one who has sacrificed home, spouse, brothers and sisters, parents, children, whatever, will lose out. It will all come back multiplied many times over in your lifetime. And then the bonus of eternal life. We could get caught up in this whole thing about what is the needle, whether it's a gate in the wall or if it's truly a needle. The point is the disciples recognize, well, then who possibly can be saved? It goes back to that question, like, how are we healed? How are we saved? Nobody. Not if you're on your own. And then he kind of wraps it up with this kind of promise that you won't regret. I don't think there's a real answer here. He's saying, like, yeah, Peter says we've given up everything. He says, yeah, but at no point is he saying that you're giving up on life. At no point is he saying you're asked to kind of wear like a camel's shirt, a hair shirt. You're not asked to take on a life that's drudgery. He's just simply, I think, again, pointing back to you've given everything up, and yet life continues. You've given everything up. How do we invest back in life? If we're going to, the things that I would suggest these are stories that I think we can play with. There's a place certainly for good exegesis and looking through the words and that kind of thing. They're helpful. But I think actually at that point, then we need to throw them out there to be fun, to be played with. They have lots of possibilities. I think one of them is imagine possibilities. Part of this is to instill the inspiration to imagine. Okay, and that's the question that you keep coming up, and I'm glad I don't have to answer those questions. Okay, but imagine what are the possibilities in the cell of this system that we live in? Can we recognize how it forms us, how it fuels us? It limits our possibilities. The shrewd manager is able to see possibilities that weren't there before. Desperation perhaps drove them to it. Okay. The other is practice the possibilities. They don't need to be perfect. They can't be perfect. What we got now is not perfect. So why uphold that? Why uphold that expectation? Anybody know what a skunk works is? No. I lived in Pasadena, California for a while, and JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs, which is the folks that send things into space there. And they have a whole skunk works area, which is they try things. It's a great place for people who are very creative and smarter than I to play around with possibilities. And sometimes they don't work. Sometimes they do. That's how we got Tang. They were looking,
Things that didn't work.
Maybe not my best example. But, part of this is perhaps to imagine church as a skunk works. How do we imagine some of this possibilities? And also walk in resurrection. Resurrection might not convince others, but it is the thing that is held here. Being held in Abraham's bosom. Being found in new households. Being given up for the ways that really make life. I think it's about time to break. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you.
One more thing, if you have any questions, there is part back there, and yeah, when someone says, "What did you do on your Sunday morning?" Man, this church is fun to watch them just serve. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it, everybody. We'll be down Fellowship Hall next week.
Yeah.